time for Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive.
Joan, as always, exceptional work from you from, your TV days all the way up to the day. You're truly exceptional, and thanks for this great show you have.
It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here this Tuesday, January 14th. I don't know if you listened to any of the Pete Hegseth hearings this morning. By the way, the other hearings were canceled. Yeah. The guy who was supposed to head Veterans Affairs, Doug Burgum, who was supposed to be head of Interior, they were supposed to face committee hearings today, but the crack Trump transition team, it didn't get the paperwork, to the committee. It didn't get all the paperwork, that the committee members require ahead of time to talk to somebody. Nah. It's not quite ready. Apparently, Tulsi Gabbard's hearing that was scheduled for Friday is also, we're not ready for that one either. So Hegseth had the stage to himself. Yeah. Had the stage to himself. And it went exactly how you thought it was going to go. Come on. The guy is accusing the hearings of people of asking him questions in what he's describing as a smear campaign. But they asked him questions about things that he had already said. He himself had said publicly. And he made it seem like it's a smear campaign. Oh, how dare you use my words against me? Mazie Hirono, like you said that you'd stop drinking if you got this job. So are you willing to say that if you get this job and you drink on the job, you'll resign? Silence. He was asked, would you be open to a more thorough FBI screening? Would you let them talk to your ex-wives? Would you let them talk to the woman who accuses you of raping her? Didn't have much to say about that one either. It's a clown car cabinet. This is a man who wants to be in charge of the military? Seriously? I don't know. Republicans who expressed initial concern over Pete Hegseth, like Joni Ernst of Iowa. Apparently, Joni Ernst was behind the scenes subject to a big pressure campaign. Joni, we need you to get this guy in office. Will they succumb? Because let's face it, Democrats can point out all of the inadequacies of Pete Hegseth. But if the Republicans close ranks and decide that dear Führer wants these people and they don't want any trouble, then we're going to see. There was a huge pressure campaign not that long ago when all this crap started coming out about Pete Hegseth, who, by the way, Pete Hegseth was offered the job by Donald Trump before any vetting had taken place. They were as shocked as anybody to find out that he had paid off a woman who accused him of raping her. They were as shocked as anybody to find that two nonprofits that he'd been in charge of both accused him of financial malfeasance. Two nonprofits having to do with veterans. that he basically ran into the ground because he likes to party, that Pete does. And he likes to spend a lot of the budget on having meetings all around the country at hotels, and then let's have dinner and let's party. Some of what he has said before, he didn't back away from. I mean, he really thinks that any programs that have to do with DEI are the devil. That apparently he still feels confident enough to talk about, but it was exactly how you thought it was going to go. No better, maybe a little worse. But again, Democrats can scream loud and long that the guy has an admitted problem with alcohol, paid off a woman who accused him of rape so that he could keep his weekend job with Fox. And the Trump administration learned none of this until after they'd already made the announcement that he was the pick. So what are the Republicans in the Senate going to do? What are they going to do? Tulsi Gabbard, in my opinion, Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth are the worst of the lot, followed very closely by Robert Kennedy Jr., Doug Burgum for the Interior. Some people who in a normal world would be considered unqualified are starting to look like stars. I mean, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State is starting to look like Thomas Jefferson, for God's sake. But it's a very low bar. We are opening up the phone lines, 773-763-9278, 773-763-9278. Lots to talk about. I'm going to share a little bit right now. I was perusing social media today, and I don't want to dwell on this. I mean, we could do the entire afternoon on people asking Pete Hegseth tough questions. But what's the point? I do want to share this with you only to show that the Democrats aren't just rolling over. That's one thing that I think is, I'm going to share two clips that I sent to Paul this morning. The first one is Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who let Hegseth start to answer, but wasn't going to let him get away with saying things that were lies. I'm kind of surprised he even tried that. You would think if he really wanted to get confirmed, he would find a way. Maybe that was why when Mazie Hirono asked him if he would agree to resign if he ever drank on the job, maybe that's why he just sat there. Maybe that's why he just sat there in silence. What do you think? Anyway, this is Senator Kirsten Gillibrand having an interesting exchange with the man that Donald Trump thinks should be in charge of an $800 billion budget and the entire U.S. military. Listen to this.
Standards have been changed inside infantry training units, Ranger School, infantry battalions, to ensure that
give me one example. Please give me an example. I get you're making these generalized statements.
Commanders meet quotas to have a certain number of female infantry officers or infantry enlisted, and that disparages those women
Commanders
who are
do not have to meet quotas for the infantry. Commanders do not have to have a quota for women in the infantry. That does not exist. It does not exist. And your statements are creating the impression that these exist, because they do not. There are not quotas. We want the most lethal force. But I'm telling you, having been here for 15 years listening to testimony about men and women in combat and the type of operations that were successful in Afghanistan and in Iraq, women were essential for many of those units. When Ranger units went in to find where the terrorists hiding in Afghanistan or in Iraq, if they had a woman in the unit, they could go in, talk to the women in a village, say, where are the terrorists hiding? Where are the weapons hiding? And get crucial information to make sure that we can win that battle. So you cannot denigrate women in general, and your statements do that. We don't want women in the military, especially in combat. What a terrible statement. So please, do not deny that you've made those statements. You have. We take the responsibility of standards very seriously, and we will work with you. I'm equally distressed you would not meet with me before this hearing. We could have covered all of this before you came here, so I could get to the 15 other questions that I want to get to. So women, you have denigrated. You have also denigrated members of the LGBTQ community. Did you know that when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in place, we lost so many crucial personnel, over 1,000 in mission-critical areas. We lost 10% of all our foreign language speakers because of a political policy. You said in your statement, you don't want politics in the DOD. Everything you've said in these public statements is politics. I don't want women. I don't want moms. What's wrong with a mom, by the way? Once you have babies, you therefore are no longer able to be lethal. I mean, you're basically saying women, after they have children, can't ever serve in the military in a combat role. It's a silly thing to say. It's a silly thing to say, beneath the position that you are aspiring to.
Well, whether or not that made any impact on Mr. Hegseth, maybe these strong statements from Democrats will so embarrass Republican senators on this Armed Services Committee that this nomination will die in committee. But that's not going to happen without Republicans. Not going to happen. The ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee is a Democrat by the name of Senator Jack Reed. He's been on that committee for a very, very, very long time. He's the Democrat from Rhode Island. He also had a very interesting exchange with Mr. Hegseth. In part, Senator Reed, again, ranking member, which means he's been on that committee for a while. He has, as part of that committee, he has interviewed many candidates to be head of the Department of Defense. And he has supported them. Even in his first term, Donald Trump's nominee to head DOD got Reed's support. So Reed can't be accused of being, one of these hyper-partisan people that if there isn't the right initial by your name, I'm not going to support you. Reed has not only supported Republicans, he has supported previous choices by Donald Trump. So that brings a little bit of extra weight to Jack Reed's comments. Again, he's the Democratic senator from Rhode Island. He is the Democrat with the most experience on the Armed Services Committee. Listen to what he and Pete Hegseth had to say to one another today.
Indeed, the challenge of the Secretary of Defense is to remove partisan politics from the military. You propose to inject it. This would be an insult to the men and women who have sworn to uphold their own apolitical duty to the Constitution. Mr. Hegseth, you are the 9th nominee for Secretary of Defense that I've had the honor to consider as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I have voted in favor of all your predecessors, including those in the first Trump administration. Unfortunately, you lack the character and composure and competence to hold the position of Secretary of Defense. Thank you.
You lacked the competence. I don't know. Is this ridiculously unqualified man going to be in charge of our military? Republicans in this committee can stop this nomination in its tracks. In its tracks. Will they, or will they roll over? I guess we will find out. One other thing that I want to talk about, the Jack Smith. He has two reports. One is in Florida on the mishandling of the classified documents. One is in Washington on the January 6th insurrection accusations. Jack Smith's January 6th report has not completely unredacted, but it has been released. And the bottom line here, kids, I haven't read the whole report yet, but the reporting on it says it makes it very clear. Jack Smith believed that Donald Trump was guilty and that there was sufficient evidence that Donald Trump would be found guilty in relation to the January 6th insurrection. Jack Smith also acknowledges that it all became a moot point when Donald Trump was reelected. So he immediately closed the case, and last Friday, after he finished his reports and submitted them to Merrick Garland and the other judiciary folks who get a peek at him, he resigned. And if I were Jack Smith, man, I would find an out-of-the-way Caribbean island, and I would just go and put my feet up. This can't have been enjoyable for him. And he also knows that he's a target. Whatever sycophant Trump installs as head of the DOJ, and he wants Pam Bondi in that role. Remember Pam Bondi? She was the Attorney General of Florida. May still be if she hasn't officially resigned yet. She was looking at whether or not to bring charges against Trump. And then all of a sudden, Trump made a $25,000 donation to her reelection campaign. And shortly thereafter, she decided that state charges against Trump just were not warranted. You know, in many fields, the appearance of impropriety is just as bad as actual impropriety. If people think you're corrupt, especially if you're in a position where you're supposed to not be corrupt, like head of the DOJ, if you've done things that might lead people to think that you can be bought, that used to be grounds for disqualification. Back in before times when people cared about, doing the right thing in character. Yeah, I think we can pretty much hang that up for the next 4 years. I think our plan for the next 4 years is survive, just survival mode. Trying to keep the worst of the nonsense at bay and just keeping our heads down. And a lot of people are once again bringing up the fact that Merrick Garland waited a full year before bringing on the special counsel to investigate whether or not charges should be brought against Trump. He waited a full year. 2020 hindsight, maybe he thought if he waited and then hired a special counsel, he would somehow rise above charges that this was all politically motivated, which he was going to get anyway, because that's how Republicans operate now. What a difference a year would have made. We were so close. We were so close. If Merrick Garland had moved more quickly, if some of this stuff had gone to trial, would we have seen Donald Trump actually get jail time? If you or I did an eighth of what Donald Trump has done, we would be in jail. But he has received special treatment at every turn. And now he's going to give us the Donald Trump special treatment. Ooh, can't wait. Can't wait. Let's go to the phone lines. Victor is on the line. Hello, Victor. Thanks for calling in today.
I love your show, Joan Esposito. You are really right on the money today and every day.
Well, that's very kind of you, Victor.
And you're very intelligent. I would like to say, don't worry about Jack Smith becoming a target, because all Democrats are going to become a target once Trump gets in there anyway. Mm-hmm. And as far as Hegseth, he said that he wants to change the military. He wants to make it more warlike, and he wants to be the military be full of warriors. Those were his exact quotes. So here's what we do know. Donald Trump always telegraphs what he wants to do. And he said he wants to go to war against Greenland and Panama and God knows who else or where else. And in order for that to happen, he needs his stooge and flunky, Hegseth, to be on the same page and change the military into a war machine. Now, President Biden, for 4 years, even though we were going through 3 wars actually, including Afghanistan, he pulled out of Afghanistan, and we never had any boots on the ground in Ukraine or in Israel. And it's obvious that Donald Trump wants to change the dynamics of that, because he did say change, right? So if you're going to change from a peaceful defensive posture into a warlike posture, that means Americans are going to go to war and die again, just like they did in Iraq.
Well, it's interesting, Victor, because one of the senators asked Pete Hegseth, if you get an order that from Donald Trump telling you that he wants the military to invade Greenland, will you obey that order? And he just was silent. He wouldn't say anything. Silent.
Of course, because that is the plan. And this idea that he paid hush money to the victim that he raped, and he had a non-disclosure agreement.
And he said publicly that she doesn't have to abide by it. She can tell her story. And then Hegseth's lawyer sent her a letter saying, if you say anything, we're going to sue you for defamation. So, that was really meaningful.
If he wasn't guilty, he wouldn't need this sort of agreement with someone. The same with Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels. If you're not guilty, why would you even need a non-disclosure agreement? So, it's all BS from the Trump administration as usual. And we're going to, like you said, we're going to have 40 years of watching Donald Trump try to pull the wool over everybody's eyes again.
Yeah.
But I don't believe he's going to round up any immigrants, non-documented immigrants, because he hasn't said a word about it for the last 2 weeks. So obviously it's off the calendar, I think.
Yeah, either that or he just forgot. Maybe he forgot he said it, Victor. What do you think? I forget stuff all the time, and I'm younger than he is. Anyway, Victor, thank you for the call. I've got to get to a break. Really glad you called today. We are going to take a break, and we're going to be back with more calls and more texts right after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
We are talking about the news of the day. We are taking your calls. Let's go back to the phone lines. Our good friend Steve is on from the Gold Coast. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Fine, thank you. I wanted to make a couple of points, if I might.
Sure.
And I think you're absolutely correct with regard to the sort of bad judgment exercise on the part of prosecutors and others. Let's face it, the easy way out for them would have been, Donald Trump perhaps tries to throw his hat in the ring for the nomination again. Doesn't get it, and the Republicans, no way they're crazy enough to nominate him the second time. Assuming he does get the nomination, he loses. And basically that opens up the door because who's out there, defending him at that point? He's not in power. He's not going to be back in power. So then, it's a much less, shall we say, bothersome process. So there's not as much, shall we say, to fight through in terms of the politics of the jungle any longer. But they exercised, bad judgment. He got the nomination and he won the general election. So now it becomes, what we are today. He basically gets off the hook. This idea that after the fact, that's possible, I suppose. But, what good does it do in terms of the damage he's going to do in the next 4 years?
Exactly.
So, yeah. You can talk. I really don't care what happens to him at that point. When somebody else is in office, be it a Republican or a Democrat, okay, Donald Trump serves 10 years, 20 years if he gets life. It doesn't have any impact on what he's going to do in that.
The sad news is if the person who follows him is another Republican, they're just going to pardon him. They're going to exonerate him. They're going to pardon him. There will never be any consequences for any of this from Donald Trump. Never. Never.
Exactly, because even after Donald Trump, there'll still be a MAGA movement, and then you can placate those people in the same way that Gerald Ford said, you know what, I'll placate the Nixonites and pardon Nixon, and then therefore we can move forward. And I'll solidify that base and then move forward and hopefully get independents and some Democrats to vote for me. But, but basically Nixon was never held to account. Donald Trump isn't going to be held to account. An interesting
sort of factoid related to that, Gerald Ford, of course, is deceased, but his son was interviewed, and his son said that Gerald Ford, for his entire post-presidency, was furious that the only thing anybody ever knew him for, the only thing anybody ever talked about, was the fact that he pardoned Nixon. And I saw for a 50th anniversary of Watergate, I was at a panel where both John Dean and Jill Wine-Banks were speaking, and they both said that Gerald Ford, no matter what they thought at the time, healing the country, et cetera, and so forth, looking back, they both believe that it was a huge mistake for Gerald Ford to pardon Richard Nixon, because it started this whole idea of presidents not being accountable.
Exactly, the imperial presidency and this idea about, this notion of holding people accountable. And I understand wanting to move forward. And I think that's something that Democrats tend to do more so than Republicans, and say we need to heal, we need to move on, let's just put it behind us. Barack Obama, to his credit, I think he's a great president, and he made a lot of great decisions as president. One of the things that I perhaps would disagree with him on is putting behind us the Iraq War and everything else that happened as if, we just need to move on and go forward. The thousands of American lives lost, not to mention untold numbers of other people in other countries based on a lie, and no one was held accountable.
Right.
I think that's a mistake. You need to send the right message that you get a country into war, if even one person dies, we're going to hold you accountable so that the next guy knows that there's a price to be paid.
Heck, Steve, we couldn't hold any bankers accountable when the banking crash occurred. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was brought up on charges. We can't get There's a real benefit that if you are a white-collar person, even if you're not the president, the judicial system works differently for you.
Yeah, I mean, especially when the entire system would have been indicted. I mean, so in other words, yes, we can prosecute everybody on Wall Street and everybody working in investment banking, except then the country would have come to a screeching halt. If it had been 10 guys, 20 guys, 50 guys, you could do it. Unfortunately, they said, you know what, with enough people who are intricate part of the economy do this, we can't really do anything about it. And that's the sad thing is, you know, too big to fail.
Yeah. So here we are, and here we shall be. My hope is that we really only have to put up with 2 years of absolute chaos, not 4, because I'm hoping that there will be a reaction to the Trump presidency and that we will regain either the House or the Senate, hopefully both, and Democrats will be able to put the brakes on Trump's worst impulses.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. You can create barriers in terms of the Congress. You can also create barriers before that if you have just a couple of Republicans in the House, 1 or 2 in the Senate that say, no, you know, well, this is a bridge too far. We cannot do this. And I'm hoping that that is the case. So we have yet to see whether there will be. I know on some issues, for instance, there's a lot of division in terms of funding to Ukraine. A lot of Republicans who want us to continue to fight that war because they feel as if we're on the right side of it, morally and otherwise, in terms of our political interests and so forth. And then there are the MAGA people who think that, you know, well, you know, let Vladimir Putin take anything he wants. It's not our concern, or, hey, more power to him. So it depends on the issue. I'm hoping that there are a few people, as I said, in the Republican Party who stand up and say, you know what, let's do the right thing. And also in terms of, you know, securing their own political future. Not everybody is in a secure seat defined by MAGA.
Well, that's going to be the hope. If somebody is in a seat that a Democrat could really potentially win back, maybe there will be more pressure. Maybe there will be more interest, self-interest, self-preservation interest for them to stand up to some of this nonsense. We'll see. I don't know. I've been so disappointed before, Steve.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, with regard to the Senate, I mean, people need to remember that only 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So what happened in 2024 is that the Democrats were particularly vulnerable because that third of senators who were up for re-election were largely in Republican states. Now, in 2026, now we have an advantage as Democrats because that's where we can pick up seats. And, of course, the party in power are the ones that tend to lose seats in midterm. So we shall see.
We shall see. Thanks for the call, Steve. Thank you very much. Let's take one more call before we have to go to break. Chris is on the line from Chicago. Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Joan?
So far, so good, but it's Tuesday. There's still time for the week to just tank.
This is true. So I was wanting to comment on the Hegseth committee hearing today. So when he was asked about that question about orders from Trump about invading Greenland, are these really moot issues considering that you have to have an act of Congress to go to war?
Yeah, except that presidents have gotten around that in the past. Barack Obama went to Congress to find out if he could do military action in Syria, and Congress said no. But George Bush didn't go after any kind of congressional approval. You know, it would not be – Trump isn't a rule follower anyway. I mean, the question was, if Trump orders you to do it, are you going to do it? And if Trump wants to invade Greenland, which I still think is something that he's using – to distract people from the real stuff he's trying to accomplish, like tax cuts for billionaires. He wouldn't. Donald Trump isn't a rule follower. He's not going to go to Congress. He's going to pick up the phone and tell Hegseth, "Hey, I want you to get plans ready. We're going to invade Greenland this coming Monday."
So
it's not according to the rules. It's not the way it's supposed to happen. But you know, I don't for one second think Donald Trump would do it right.
But we are a NATO member as well, and so are they.
Yes, I know,
so
and we would be actually going after one of our allies, wouldn't we? We would be attacking, because Greenland is part of the Danish Commonwealth, which is something that I didn't realize, not that I've spent that much time, studying Greenland. But, yeah, we would be attacking a NATO ally. Not that Donald Trump cares about that either.
That's so ridiculous. No, he doesn't. He doesn't care about any of it. It's absolutely disgusting. And I think you're correct that Merrick Garland did a disservice to the American people by dragging his feet for a year about indicting Trump. I think that from a legislative standpoint, Congress really needs to get a law intact that states that if you are under an investigation or if you've committed crimes against the United States government, you shouldn't even be allowed to run for the presidency. I mean, until those cases are completely cleared and you have been found innocent of those accusations. In this case, we all knew that he wasn't going to be, and we all know he ran for the presidency to avoid being accountable for the things that he did. So I think it's a disservice to the American people. But the other thing is about TikTok. So we're running out the clock here on TikTok with regards to the government deciding that they are no longer going to allow it to be a platform in the U.S. And then there's discussion, which has been disputed by TikTok, about Elon Musk potentially purchasing TikTok, which would be a complete disaster given what he's done with Twitter. And all the other propaganda, 1,500, I think, right-wing stations in that are controlling our media platforms. But what about the fact that what about when these things start becoming monopolies, and we're not enforcing the antitrust laws in this country, where these people are owning all of this, and they're getting rid of TikTok because they're afraid of misinformation and all this other stuff, but yet they're allowing American companies to do essentially just that.
Yeah. Their argument is that TikTok is being used by the Chinese government to collect data on people here in the United States. And that's why they're saying that it will only be allowed to go forward and exist if China sells it to somebody else. I don't know. I mean, I once talked to, a year or so ago, I talked to a young person who had a company, and they were using TikTok very successfully for politicians. And I said, well, what about if I have a TikTok account, doesn't that mean that, all my data will be exposed? And she looked at me and she said, you mean like how on your phone and on your computer, your data's there for anybody, and how if you're on Instagram or Facebook, your data's there for anybody? She looked at me like, why do you think TikTok is any different? And I was like, oh, I never thought about it like that. She was like, basically your data is already out there. So
this is true. I agree. It is out there. So it's just really crazy. I think we're in a very precarious time, and it's going to be a very rough 4 years. And with so much disinformation out there, you come across these people on these social platforms, and they're so delusional about the facts and the misinformation. And you feel the need to try and correct it, but there is no telling them the truth. There's sets of facts and there's sets of reality, and we're definitely in a time where people are not on the same playing field, and it makes it very difficult.
Amen to that. Chris, thank you so much for the call. We've got to get to a break. We are going to take a real quick break. We're going to be back with more right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I want to give you a brief update on the fires in Los Angeles, and I'm afraid it ain't good news. There was a bit of a respite when the winds died down. Firefighters were able to make headway against the fires. But it is predicted that this afternoon and tonight and on until Wednesday morning, the winds are going to pick back up again. And it is the wind that is spreading the fire. So it ain't over. The National Weather Service has something that they call it, well, we call it a red flag warning. They term it a particularly dangerous situation. And generally when they issue that kind of a warning, that means, guys, there's going to be a fire. There is now a red flag warning for parts of Los Angeles and Ventura counties. It started this morning, and it runs until tomorrow at noon. And from the National Weather Service, the quote is, "This setup is about as bad as it gets." Brentwood is now in danger. Pacific Palisades is virtually gone, as is Altadena virtually gone. The one young woman I mentioned earlier in the week, she and her husband and their toddler moved into my friend's apartment. They called him at 6 a.m. and they said they had to evacuate. They went back. Their home was destroyed. They went back a second time and found that their home had been looted of anything valuable that survived the fire. And they went back a third time to find that their home was actually burning again. That's a big problem here, is reignition. As a matter of fact, let's correct some misinformation. You know, yesterday I did a real long explanation of the incarcerated firefighters, because there's a lot of misinformation about how they're being used and abused. And that is not the case at all. They make money. They get early time off their sentences. They get their record expunged. The one formerly incarcerated firefighter who wrote this big, long thread on Threads explaining all this said most people don't do it for the money, though when you finally get paroled, and he got paroled a year and a half early, but when you get paroled, you have money. And then shortly thereafter, you can get your record expunged, which of course means that you're back able to rent a place and get a job, just like people who didn't go to prison. And so there is a lot of talk that somehow these fires were caused. Well, the Republicans want you to think the fires were caused by Democrats, which is absurd. More and more I'm reading about this phenomenon called reignition. When there's a fire, a wildfire, even if it gets put out, even if it's out, days later, it can reignite. I don't understand how it happens, but there was a hilltop fire New Year's Eve that is believed to have been caused by stray fireworks. That hilltop fire was extinguished. But they're doing these kinds of aerial photographs of the area and to try to figure out like what's hot, what's cold, and where things moved and why. It is a real possibility that seems to be gathering more steam here, that this hilltop fire that was originally caused by New Year's Eve fireworks somehow days later reignited. It reignited, only this time there were 80 to 100 mile an hour Santa Ana winds. And when it reignited, the embers were spread far and wide. We may find out that there was another reason or there's more to it, but if you look, there are pictures on social media, and I know the Washington Post has them, aerial photos that show this area that burned because of the fireworks, and that it appears that the Pacific Palisades fire originated right next to that. But where we are today, there was a respite, but it is believed that today, tonight, tomorrow morning, until noon tomorrow, the fire may spread, may gain ground, because the winds are expected to pick up again. The winds are expected to subside sometime on Thursday. Who knows for how long? The evacuation warnings are still in place. My daughter lives in Burbank. Luckily, she had extended her stay at home. And then when we saw what was happening, she has decided to stay at home until things are settled down. Her roommate, who came home before her, has been working from home, but said even though there is no fire in Burbank, the air quality is just abysmal. Just abysmal. And it's toxic smoke. Remember, this isn't wood smoke. This is the smoke of burning houses. So there's electrical stuff, there's rubber, there's plastic, there's chemicals in this smoke. Talked to, I've got another friend who's living out there and who said it's just awful. It's just awful. And let's just hope that these winds die down and that the firefighters are able to make some progress. Let's go back to the phone lines. Our good friend Dave from Hoffman Estates is on the line. Hey, Dave, how are you? Dave, are you there? Dave?
There we go.
There we go. There you are.
You guys were talking about President Obama a couple of calls ago. A couple of the negative stuff I recall, and I voted twice for this man. Remember how us Dems and Libs just were drooling, chomping at the bit that he's going to take care of George W. Bush and Cheney? Yeah. And the first thing he come out and said that's in the past. We're looking forward. We're not going to do nothing. One disappointment. And then the other thing for the single payer. Well, I got shot down like a clay pigeon.
Joe Lieberman shot that down.
Yes,
they had enough Democratic votes to enact the Affordable Care Act, and there was a single-payer provision. And Joe Lieberman, the guy who left to create no labels, that fine human being, said, I won't vote for it if there's a single-payer option. And he single-handedly killed it.
Yep, because he was, I think he was still pouting for after Al Gore. He was going to be Gore's running mate, and he lost. And like you said, he jumped to a different party, like independent and stuff. And so he figured he'd get one last stick in on the Democratic Party. And then lastly, the thing was disappointed was the Syria that time. And he kept, when they were doing them barrel bombs and all of that stuff, and he kept saying that this is the red line. Okay, they went over. And then you cross this. So that kind of reminded me of that Andy Griffith show when that
But our lack of involvement in Syria is directly tied to Congress. As Chris was pointing out, the way a president is supposed to bring about armed conflict is going to the Congress and saying, this is happening, we need to send armed troops to this place. And Congress approves it. And Barack Obama went to Congress and said, we need to bring armed troops to this conflict in Syria. And Congress said no. So
well, we had ships and everything in the bays and stuff. We're just waiting for it. But them were some disappointments. It just seemed, that kind of, he got pushed over a little bit by some of these more senior senators and stuff like that, because he went in, he didn't even do one term as a senator, and he ran, so
that's true.
They knew the game, and that, but that just, disappointed with the thing, like when we wanted him to go after Bush and he didn't, But at least one thing under them, though, they were much more cordial than what the guy that followed them.
Amen to that.
You know, and
amen to that. Did you see George Bush give Barack Obama that little bro bump at the Jimmy Carter funeral?
Yep. And
after he walked right by Donald Trump without even looking at him. Yep.
I know he made a big beeline like around him. I also heard that Michelle's not going to go to the inauguration.
Nope, she's not. You know, I don't know if you read her book. She's very bright. She's very accomplished.
Oh, yeah.
She was a good first lady, but she hates politics with a passion. And, you know, she was a big campaigner for Kamala. And I got to tell you, if I were in her position, I don't know if I'd want to go either. Were we going to, pretend? Pretend? I don't know.
Yeah, they should have pouted. All the former presidents should pout like Trump did 4 years ago. But they actually believe that there's formalities. You know, they believe in them. So, and like,
it doesn't bother me that she's not going. I don't really care.
Yeah, Joan. And like Hillary, she was smarter than Bill, too.
Yeah.
True. So, anyway, let me clear off. I know you got to...
Okay, we got to get to the news.
Thanks, Joan.
Thanks, Dave. We are going to go to the news right now, and we're going to have more after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I'm very pleased to welcome Simon Schuster, who's the Capitol reporter at Bridge, Michigan. This is in our continuing effort to learn what's happening in the state legislatures of states other than Illinois, which we always seem to focus on. Simon, how are you today? Happy 2025.
Good. Thanks for having me on, Joan.
I want to talk to you. I want to start with something that you need to explain to us. Now there is a divided bipartisan government because Republicans took back the State House in November. But before that, there was a Democratic trifecta of both houses in the state, plus the governor's position. So I'm really curious. I know that, especially in the lame duck session, there was a lot of legislation that Democrats wanted to get done, and they didn't. What happened?
Yeah, so this is the culmination of tensions that we've seen. Well, first, if I step back a moment, it's important to note that this is the first Democratic trifecta that Democrats had in Michigan state government for 40 years. And so they came into this with a lot of ambitions and scopes for what they wanted to accomplish in terms of policy. And they did get a lot of things done, but in 2024, the state legislature met very little. An election year, as you know, lawmakers were certainly distracted with their electoral aims. And unfortunately, Democrats then lost control of the Michigan House in that election. And so coming into lame duck, they had a lot of sort of ambition for hundreds of bills that they wanted to get passed that hadn't seen action throughout this course of this legislative session. But it's important to note that in the Michigan Senate, the Democrats had a 2018 majority, and in the Michigan House with 110 seats, it was even closer, a 56 to 54 seat split. So as a result, if they lost one Democratic vote on any particular policy issue that was passing along party lines, then that legislation could not pass. And we've seen throughout the course of this legislative session sort of a progressive contingent of the party feeling a little bit of tension with more moderate Republicans or more moderate Democrats or Democrats who might be sort of, not along a traditional ideological spectrum. And so with all of that teed up and ready to go, there was hundreds of bills that various members of the legislature were looking to see passed. And then with just a few days left in the legislative session, on the final days that these were available, we had one Democratic legislator, Karen Whitsitt of Detroit, declare that she was not going to attend legislative session and that she had little interest in doing so to help out any of these other legislators with their policy priorities. And as a result, they could no longer hold a quorum because the Republicans themselves had walked out in protest. And with an inability to hold a quorum, then the former House Speaker, Joe Tate, had to abruptly adjourn session for the year, effectively leaving hundreds of bills on the table that otherwise may or may not have seen action in those final few days.
Who made her mad? What was her problem?
Well, Karen Whitsett, as a legislator, has often been someone who's willing to sort of break with party norms, sort of transgress with Democrats, too much to their chagrin. You may recall back in early 2020, she made national news because she had contracted COVID-19 and then said that she heeded then President Donald Trump's advice to take ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and she met with him in the White House, personally thanking him in front of many TV cameras, claiming that he had saved her life. So she's somebody who sort of operates outside of traditional Democratic bounds and often speaks about how her only interest is in her constituents, and that although she may not be showing up for legislative session, all she has to do is talk to her constituents and explain to them why she's doing what she's doing, and that's all that matters.
Does she come from a district that has a lot of red voters? Because sometimes I know Democrats twist themselves into a very Republican-like position because they don't want to alienate the conservative voters in their district. Is that the case here?
In fact, not at all. No, her district is entirely within the city of Detroit, and she has a constituency that is predominantly black. These are very Democratic voters, but at the same time, there's sort of a politics that you might say somewhat like Chicago and Detroit operates that under a system of maybe patronage, influence. And so as long as you have your seat secure and you're able to talk to the right people who sort of dispense political opportunity, they can make sure that you're able to win that primary and get elected. And Karen Whitsett is someone who's had a lot of cachet in her community. She has a lot of rapport with her constituency. And frankly, they listen to her and they understand why the decisions that she makes.
Wow. That's interesting. You know, Simon, this is not exactly maybe part of Capitol Reporter's purview, but there's been a lot of talk. You know, we WCPT, we're a liberal station, we're a Democratic station. We talk about these kinds of issues all the time. And with the presidential election, I'm not an expert on what is going on in Michigan, and certainly not the Detroit area, but the sense was that the Muslim population in and around Detroit was so disillusioned with Joe Biden. I mean, I think in the Detroit area there were nearly 20,000 votes for Jill Stein, and it was thought that, you know, maybe that was that particular population protesting. Do you have any insight into that? Is that good information or bad information? As you know, I mean, I know that anytime you describe any population, voters or not voters, with a broad brush, you're not going to get it exactly right. But what is tell us about how you see the politics of the Detroit area.
Sure. And I mean, certainly, you know, obviously there's a very large Arab American population in Metro Detroit that is electorally significant. And one of the main narratives that we heard in the presidential election was about people's disillusionment with Democrats due to the handling of the conflict in Gaza and their belief that maybe there's a chance that they could have a shot at peace, at stopping the killing of, frankly, their family members, neighbors, and friends in the Middle East with Donald Trump. And this was certainly a narrative that was pushed very heavily by the Trump campaign. And we did hear from activists, Arab activists, both community leaders, faith leaders there, and some activists who thought that, you know, this is not even necessarily so much about endorsing former President Trump as it was about punishing Democrats, showing them that because you refuse to listen to us throughout all of this death, that this is sort of the fate that you're going to have to accept, but at the same time, I think it's important to place this within context. And that's that the Arab American vote and votes within Dearborn, although Donald Trump very slightly carried the city of Dearborn and Jill Stein had a strong second showing in second place, it did not change the outcome of the election in Michigan in a substantial way. It was not the difference between Donald Trump winning Michigan and Kamala Harris losing Michigan. Instead, it was the fact that simply so many more people turned out for the former president, than they had in 2020. He had more than 200,000 more votes than he received in the 2020 election. And to note that while Joe Biden won Michigan by about 154,000 votes in 2020, Kamala Harris lost the state by about 82,000. And so the shift there is not necessarily that there was substantially fewer votes for Kamala Harris than in 2020, but just that there were substantially more votes for Donald Trump from folks who would otherwise have stayed home and were disinterested in his agenda. They sort of came back around to him.
Interesting take on that. I'm talking to Simon Schuster, who's the Capitol reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We are going to take a real quick break, and then we are going to talk more about what is going on in the state legislature in that state that is near and dear to us, Michigan. We'll be right back after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
And I'm joined by Simon Schuster, who's the Capitol reporter at Bridge, Michigan. Simon, I want to talk about the governor's race and some recent folks who have emerged. Talk to me about that, if you would.
Yeah, certainly. We're gearing up now, even though the 2024 election has just concluded here. We are already gearing up for what's bound to be a very interesting 2026 gubernatorial election, in that Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's very popular in the state, is going to be term limited out. And so it's going to be an open race. And this race was effectively, the dynamics of it were upended because although few candidates have declared as of this date, the first candidate to declare was Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan. And he's somebody he's in his third term as Detroit mayor. He led the city through bankruptcy and is now on an economic upswing. The city, for listeners who aren't familiar, has really achieved a level of cultural and economic resurgence that is truly a sort of a Cinderella story, given the level of decline in population and economic circumstances that it endured over the past few decades. So with all that as background, he's someone who has a lot of cachet and popularity within Democratic politics. And so last month in December, he sort of shocked Michigan politics by announcing that he was going to run for governor, which was not surprising to anybody, but not on the Democratic ticket. He's going to run instead as an independent candidate with no party affiliation, or at least that's as he intends as of this time. And so that means that Democrats now are struggling with, they're going to have to field a candidate and have to go against somebody who's one of the most popular political figures in the state, and ensure that, that he doesn't take enough votes away from Democrats to not only not win himself, but allow a Republican to become governor in 2026. And so this has been, Democrats have been going around talking about this election, and there's an enormous amount of bitterness that they're feeling towards Mike Duggan because of the feelings that he's abandoned the party. And there's
he hasn't he?
Yes, I think that when you listen to him speak rhetorically, yes. I think ideologically, he definitely resembles someone and maintains somebody who's a moderate Democrat. But in terms of actual name and party registration, he has not renewed his membership to the Democratic Party, and he doesn't intend to seek the party's nomination for governorship.
Okay. In my experience, sometimes people leave their parties and declare themselves to be independents. Sometimes if they just disagree violently with the direction their party's going, but also sometimes if they have contacted party officials and said, hey, you know what? I think I want to run for governor. And the party officials say, oh, you know what? We have another candidate in mind who we think has a real good shot at winning. So could you just not... Any idea if either of these two scenarios applies to Mike Duggan?
Yes. So, well, to hear Mike Duggan tell it, he's someone who's grown really frustrated with sort of our political binary and the idea that there's such a hyper-partisan climate, both federally and in state government, that it makes it very difficult to get things done. And to hear him tell it, once you have a partisan label next to your name, it means that the other side immediately is not going to want to work with you, and you can't cut any deals or move things forward. As mayor of Detroit, he's benefited from the fact that it's a totally Democratic city, and that is essentially there's not that hyper-partisan back and forth that you see in other cities, so he's allowed him to move his agenda forth pretty quickly. Now, but to your question, the answer is yes to that scenario, and and that comes in the form of Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who you may be familiar with through the 2022 presidential election, where she sort of rose and achieved a national profile as someone who is often rebutting former President Donald Trump's accusations of widespread voter fraud in Michigan through a whole lot of drama in the fallout from that election. And she's someone who's also, she sailed to re-election very easily in 2022 and has also a considerable amount of popularity in Democratic circles. And is
What's her name
looking
again?
That's Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson.
Oh, yes. I didn't hear you when you said that the first time. I interviewed her at the DNC. She's very impressive.
Yeah, and so she's as someone who's emerged with a big national public profile, as someone who's positioned herself as a defender of democracy, someone who really cares a lot about ensuring that, votes are safe and accurate and that is accessible to everyone. And Michigan has had, since 2018, a series of amendments that have made voting options more and more accessible, easier to get registered to vote, sort of incrementally. And, of course, in Michigan also we have what you might call it the Department of Motor Vehicles in Illinois. We call the Secretary of State's office. She's also overhauled that and made that a considerably more user-friendly experience than it had been in the past. And everybody encounters those. While not all voters will necessarily go down to downtown Detroit and see how that city has changed, everybody does have to update their driver's license once in a while. And so they do interface with that office. And so she's somebody who, had Mike Duggan stayed in the Democratic primary, would have faced a very difficult primary battle between the two of them, given just how popular both of them are.
Huh. So I guess in a way this benefits her, that he's going to put himself on the ballot as an independent? I mean, she's still got to face him, right?
Well, it could benefit her, as it would certainly make any sort of primary fight much easier. But the challenge that she's going to have now is in a general election, where she's somebody who has a high profile in Democratic and progressive circles. Mike Duggan is going to have quite an angle to go towards the moderate vote. Essentially, his path to victory is going to be able to forge a moderate coalition of disaffected folks on both the left and the right, but towards the center, who are sick of the party labels, see the sort of pro-business-friendly changes that he's made to Detroit, all the investment he's brought into the city, and he's going after voters who are then thinking, I want that for the state of Michigan as well. I want the changes that he brought to Detroit to the rest of the state. And it's an advantage for him because he has sort of that perspective that he's been an executive of a government body in ways that Jocelyn Benson simply has not. But at the same time, she still has a considerable policy record to run off of in her own right.
We have seen before where two really good candidates they split the Democratic liberal vote to the point where neither can win, allowing a Republican to scoot in and scoop that up. Is that possible? Is it possible we're going to see Eric Nesbitt benefit from these two Democrat and former Democratic powerhouses?
Yeah, and that is sort of the thought, maybe the nightmare that Democrats are being kept up at night by right now, is trying to decide, what is the best path forward here. So far, what we've heard from Democratic Party officials is that they intend to fight Mike Duggan tooth and nail, sort of cast him out of the party and urge their supporters to reject him. At the same time, it's difficult for Republicans because while Republicans have seen some electoral success, in 2016 in Michigan and then in 2024 with Donald Trump on the ballot, statewide, their electoral record has been exceptionally poor. They haven't won a statewide race in the state except for the presidential race since 2014. And so they need to be able to build a coalition, not just of Trump, sort of MAGA diehards, which are hard to bring out in a midterm year, but they also need to bring forward and convince moderate voters to back them. It's something that Governor Gretchen Whitmer's last Republican gubernatorial opponent did not do well, and as a result, she lost by 10 percentage points in 2022 against Whitmer. And so they see Mike Duggan as someone who's going to be edging in on their slice of the pie as well.
Interesting. Hey, What is going on with the other Michigan legislator who got national attention, Mallory McMorrow? What's going on with her?
Yeah, so I do know that she has a book coming out in the near future, and her name has been floated as a DNC chair as well. But
really?
For now, it did earlier shortly after the election last year. I don't believe that she's particularly interested in pursuing that role. But for now, she's still a member of the Michigan Senate. She's eligible through 2030 to serve in that office with our statewide term limits. But for now, people continue to float her name as sort of a future congressional candidate. But we haven't really that window that sort of you want to see that politicians look for when there's an open seat, a vacancy that's perfect for them to slide into, hasn't happened yet. And especially given how competitive this gubernatorial race is going to be, I haven't heard any particular rumblings about whether she would have any gubernatorial aspirations, especially given that two of these leading candidates, including Eric Nesbitt, are people who have, a long political track records under their belt, people who have been in public office for a really long time, whereas, Senator McMorrow just came into office in 2019. So she's relatively new to seeing that compared to some of these veterans, but clearly, given the national profile she's gained, people are continuing to sort of think about what might be next for her.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you've written about is a problem that we see from coast to coast in this country, and that's dark money getting involved in elections, as well as the new problem of billionaires weighing in on our elections. I know you wrote about that as it applies to Michigan. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so in Michigan, we have a campaign finance system that makes it uniquely easy, especially in our state legislative elections, for dark money to get involved. And that's because the largest source of dark money in our state legislative races is our political parties themselves. They can each have their own accounts that they use to run what we call issue advertising, which if you've seen super PACs attacking candidates without necessarily telling you directly to vote for folks, those are generally dark money issue ads. And our parties themselves spend tens of millions of dollars every couple of years to run these ads. They fundraise. They can get money directly from corporations. And there's no contribution limits to how much they can raise from those folks. And they don't have to report who any of these people are. So we've seen an increasing level of dark money. And particularly in this last House election, we saw a record number of spending in the overall cost of the election, more than $67 million. But I think what was unique about this one is that Democrats were fighting really hard to maintain that slim control of the Michigan House that they had, and they ended up far outspending their Republican counterparts, in part because the Michigan State Republican Party had been in disarray and chaos, and it had very little money to spend on these races through its dark money accounts, whereas the Michigan State Democratic Party, they spent $13 million in dark money on the Michigan State House races, and they outspent overall Republican counterparts nearly 4-1. And yet at the same time, they still ended up losing 4 key seats and flipping control to Republicans, showing that, in these small 90,000-person districts, it still is, just a few thousand votes. As long as you concentrate resources there, you can mean the difference between a majority and minority in the legislature. Wow.
It's going to be really interesting. Michigan is actually, you guys are a little bit, the southwestern corner of Michigan receives our signal, though I don't know, most people listen on their computer anyway, Simon, so I don't know if we even care about the signal anymore. But it's a lot of people who, especially people in the Chicago area, love to go to Michigan, and a lot of people have homes in Michigan. Some of my friends have retired to Michigan. It is a Midwestern state that I think we feel pretty closely aligned with. And I really appreciate you joining us and bringing us up to speed on the inner workings of Michigan. Thank you so much.
Of course. Happy to chat anytime.
Well, we're going to hold you to that, Simon. Yes, Simon Schuster, regular contributor now to Joan Esposito, Live, Local, and Progressive. Also the Capitol reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We're going to take a break and be back with more after this.
Joan Esposito, Live, Local, and Progressive on WCPT 820.
And I'm welcoming back Dr. John Murphy, professor at the University of Illinois in the Department of Communication. He specializes in the rhetoric of the presidency. And let's see, today's Tuesday, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In about 6 days, we are going to be treated to the rhetoric of the Donald Trump inaugural address. Hello, John. Happy New Year. We haven't talked for a while.
Happy New Year. I'm not sure it feels so happy when you start like that. 6 days.
Yes. Okay, how's this? I hope you can handle the new year, John. How's that a little bit better? I hope you can survive the new year, John.
That feels a little bit more realistic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we talk about what's going to happen this coming Monday, let's talk about the last Trump inaugural address. I don't spend a lot of time listening to things Donald Trump is saying or has said, but I vaguely recall it being this dark instead of this, we're great, everything's great, and this country is going to be so great. I seem to recall it being much darker in tone. What can you tell us about the first inaugural address?
It was very much dark in tone. He referred to the speech became famous for a reference to carnage, to American carnage, that we are in a disastrous situation, that America was losing its soul, all of those kinds of comments. Trump made the mistake with that speech, which some other presidents have done as well, which is to use his inaugural as yet another campaign speech. Mm-hmm. And he didn't quite make the transition from the campaign to the presidency. And that, sometimes happens with presidents. It happened with Ulysses Grant. It has happened with a few others, where the speeches they made during the campaign and the appeals that they made just went smoothly right into the inaugural, except the inaugural is a very different occasion.
Yeah. I mean, I know that there's no guidebook, there's no style book that says, okay, you've won the election. Now tell everybody your vision for the country. But he's, this is a man who's built his whole political life on grievance. So are we going to get the ultimate grievance speech, do you think?
It's hard to tell with him. I mean, he's pretty unpredictable. The occasion calls very clearly for unity. And virtually all presidents, except for Donald Trump in 2016, have recognized that. The occasion clearly demands that you constitute or create the American people. You give your vision of the people as witnesses to the ceremony so that your assumption of power is legitimated by the people. And so you often see these references to the American people. John Kennedy, for instance, talked about a people that was born in this century, hardened by war, embittered by a difficult peace. But these people nonetheless were moving forward, and he would seek to bring an end to the Cold War. And so he constituted a people that could witness his ascension to power. And that's the problem Donald Trump generally has, is that he only sees his supporters as the people, and everybody else is sort of outside of what counts as the American people.
Well, yeah, I mean, how is this guy? And I would take issue with your statement that clearly this speech is supposed to be about vision, because I don't think that's clear to Donald Trump. I don't think.
No,
I think you're. Yeah, exactly. But this is a guy who's already talking about, that he would like to see Joe Biden in jail, and he wants to see anybody that was on the January 6th committee in jail. And I think that the idea of unity is not going to be within his grasp, John.
Yeah, I think he's going to have a very difficult time with that. I mean, one of the great paradoxes, I think, for this forthcoming administration is that he could have the greatest political success and rhetorical success simply by doing nothing. Contrary to his argument, Joe Biden has left him a country in pretty good shape. And it's even beginning to look like Biden might get an agreement in Gaza before Trump takes office. And so Biden will have cleared the decks for him. Inflation is relatively low. Employment is great. The economy is moving along. Investment is excellent. Biden is bequeathing to him a country prosperous and at peace, a country that is in many ways the envy of the world. And if Donald Trump could tamp down his grievance, he could simply announce that all of this is due to his efforts and not do anything, enjoy the White House, pass minimal budget legislation and that sort of thing, and be very popular. He won't be able to do that. He just won't. But that's exactly the situation he's inheriting.
Yeah, no, he is absolutely, completely incapable of that. I mean, when we took office the first time, it seemed that he was bound and determined to undo every single thing that Barack Obama did. And I have no reason to think that he isn't going to do the same with Joe Biden, undo everything that Joe Biden did. I mean, there was just breaking news after I was on the air that President Biden is lifting the designation of state sponsor of terrorism from Cuba. And apparently there's been some sort of deal, I believe negotiated at least in part by the Catholic Church, to free a significant number of political prisoners. And it said in the Washington Post, this is my favorite part, the incoming Trump administration is almost certain to reverse the lifting of the terrorism designation. And I think everything Joe Biden has done, particularly the things that he's done in the last few months to try to Trump-proof the government, I think that's going to be a real burr under Donald Trump's saddle, and that's what he's gonna go after. Do you think that he's going to tell us that in his speech? I mean, come on, I agree that, he has a tendency to repeat himself, but what is the inaugural address going to be about? Is it going to be about boats with batteries and sharks? I mean, is this what we're going to get? Is he going to get up there and say, you know what? Nobody wants to hear this address. Let's just play music and stand there and, bob back and forth for 40 minutes? I mean, it could be anything, John.
It could be. I am willing to admit it could be. I doubt that it will be in this case. I mean, he last time around, he sort of got this, at least the sense of a ceremonial occasion, of a ceremonial day, mostly, I think, because it's a day about him. And so he can adhere to some of the norms because they're all about lifting him up. And he very much, Donald Trump is Donald Trump's favorite topic. And so I think he will adhere to some of the norms. Again, in his first inaugural, he was far darker than usual. But he also had the sense that the inaugural address is not the place for specific policy proposals. It's for general principles. And so I would expect some mention of lowering the tax burden on Americans. I would expect some mention of, even something a little bit more specific, like lowering the price of eggs or something, or getting government.
But wait a minute, he's already addressed that. He knows he promised to bring down grocery prices, but he's not really going to be able to do that because, John, it's hard.
It's
to bring
hard.
down. Yeah, it's hard. He's now discovered that once prices are high, John, it's hard to bring them down.
So, yeah, it's hard to know what he is going to say next Monday, but I suspect it will be on a level of generality. He won't be talking about very specific policy proposals. I think there will be vague threats against individuals, that those who have opposed us, those who have stood in our way will pay the consequences or something along those lines. I doubt that he'll name specific names in the inaugural address, but he will hope to create an atmosphere of threat so that those who may oppose him will feel intimidated, will not want to oppose him, will feel the precariousness of their position with Donald Trump in charge of the Justice Department.
Well, that certainly wouldn't surprise me. Do you think, knowing what we know about this guy, Do you think it'll be a long address or a shorter one?
A shorter one. He is known for riffing and going on for a long time at rallies, but the first inaugural address that he gave was well within the norms of how long these things should be. I don't know who's writing for him now. Steve Bannon wrote much of the first one. I don't think Bannon is actually writing for him at this point. He has become more of a sort of independent political force. So I am not sure what speechwriters have been
Okay, if
working
Elon Musk is writing it, John, what can we expect?
I don't think Elon Musk has command enough of the English language to write a sentence. He can barely write a tweet. He has to end up retweeting everybody else because he can't put together a sentence long enough to make anybody pay attention.
Well, that's a really good question about who's writing it.
Yeah, I've not seen a lot of publicity about his speechwriters. Often by this point in the process, or about a week out, there's some article in like the Washington Post or the New York Times or somewhere where they will have done an interview with a potential speechwriter and say, these are the themes the president is thinking about. That they do that to sort of highlight those themes, to selectively leak key themes so that they will direct the reporters as to what they want them to listen to. But I have not seen any of that yet. So I don't know.
Well, today we were supposed to get 3 confirmation hearings for the head of the VA, for the head of the Interior, and for the head of the Department of Defense. Only one of those hearings, Pete Hegseth with DOD, took place because the Trump administration had not gotten the paperwork to the committees. What if nobody's written the speech?
That could very well be an issue. I mean, there's a paradox here. On the one hand, the last time he did this, in 2017, he was brand new to the presidency, clearly deeply uncomfortable with it. And so as a result, he surrounded himself with people who generally sort of knew what they were doing, who could at least make some of the trains run on time. Not all of them. That's why they messed up the initial version of the Muslim ban, so that it became anti-religious and thus was struck down by the court. But other things did run on time because you had these establishment guys running the stuff. Now he is appointing all of these people who are absolutely dreadful at any kind of administration.
I know.
Who have no experience. Pete Hegseth has never run anything. RFK Jr. has never run anything. His chief of staff has never run anything. In the past, you would look at these people and they would have, had significant experience at doing things, or you knew they were deeply competent, and this was a way to train them. So Pete Buttigieg had run a city, but not much more than that. And the Department of Transportation was really a place for him to earn his administrative chops, and he did. The potential, Doug Burgum, the former North Dakota governor, is a guy who's relatively competent, who's run a big business. He's being appointed, I think, to Interior, Commerce, maybe.
Yeah, he was one of the ones that was supposed to be questioned today.
Yeah. And he's a relatively competent guy. I mean, I don't agree with him, but this is a guy, who... Well,
compared to the rest of them, he looks like a giant in the field.
Yeah. He sure does. So I don't know. I suspect that when it comes to speech writing and things like that, J.D. Vance is gathering some people and shipping them over to Trump, and Trump's got some of his own people, and they'll hash something out. But it is a departure from the norm that we haven't had some kind of leaked story about which speechwriter is working on it and what themes they're going to emphasize, and sort of what they hope to accomplish with the inaugural and how they'll get the administration off to a fast start.
Oh, there you go, John, thinking that these are all, grown-ups with experience who want to do things in a classy way. Oh, John.
Well, sad to say he won the election. So somebody's got something figured out. And so I kind of figure, okay, they're getting something down on paper, but Again, I don't know. They clearly want to get off to a fast start. They clearly want, from every indication from Congress, is they want to take everything, stuff it into one gigantic budget reconciliation bill, and ram the thing through Congress. Whether they'll be able to do that is an open question. But to do that, they likely need, a strong inaugural address followed immediately perhaps by, say, a tour of the country where Trump can get out on the campaign trail again and push this stuff and try to build support for it. He's as high in the public opinion polls right now as he's ever been in his life. He's at something like 47%. And that's not very high, but it's higher than he's ever been. And so the idea, I think, would be for them to put together a sort of package, do a bunch of momentum-building events, and ram it through as quickly as possible. Because he's going to do something stupid and deeply unpopular that will diminish that support. So clearly Mike Johnson in particular wants this thing to move. He does not want – he's got too many strange conservatives in Congress. He's got a president who's mercurial at best. And so he very much wants, and John Thune in charge of the Senate very much wants, to get this package together, whip it through, and get it done. Otherwise, it could get picked apart.
Yeah. I'm talking to Dr. John Murphy, who's a professor at the University of Illinois in the communication department. He's an expert on presidential rhetoric. When we come back after this break, I want to talk a little bit about the one hearing that took place today and a decided lack of rhetoric coming from Pete Hegseth to a couple of questions. We'll be back with more after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Joining me is Dr. John Murphy, who is an expert on presidential rhetoric. He's with the communications department at the University of Illinois. Today, Pete Hegseth was interviewed by the Armed Services Committee, and at least two times that I saw, he was asked a question and simply said nothing. Senator Mazie Hirono asked him about his drinking. She specifically wanted to know that since he has talked about that if he gets this job, he'll stop drinking, would he agree that if he is drinking on the job, that he would immediately resign? I think we have that sound clip. Paul, play it now.
I have read multiple reports of your regularly being drunk at work, including by people who worked with you at Fox News. Do you know that being drunk at work is prohibited for service members under the UCMJ?
Senator, those
yes
are
or no?
multiple false anonymous reports peddled by NBC News
that
run directly contradictory to the dozens of men and women at Fox News Channel who I work with
I'm not
who came
hearing
on
the
the
answer
record
to my question.
And said
in your opening statement, Mr. Hegseth, you commit to holding leaders accountable at all levels. That includes you, of course. And frankly, as Secretary, you will be on the job 24/7. You recently promised some of my Republican colleagues that you stopped drinking and won't drink if confirmed, correct?
Absolutely.
Will you resign as Secretary of Defense if you drink on the job, which is a 24/7 position?
I've made this commitment on behalf of
Will
the men
you
and women I'm
resign
serving.
as Secretary of Defense
I've made this commitment on behalf of the men and women I'm serving because it's the most important deployment of my life.
I'm not hearing an answer to my question, so I'm going to move on.
Okay, Dr. Murphy, was that effective communication from Pete Hegseth?
No, this is one of those moments where he simply needed to say, yes, I will. Why
is that so hard? What would have been so hard about that?
Because he's afraid he can't. He's afraid that there will be a photograph taken of him having a drink. And then he will have on the record that he has to resign. I mean, when he referred to Fox News, there are photographs of a bar in his office at Fox News. So, he had a drink cart there. So it becomes really questionable. I mean, for instance, on an entirely different issue, when John Kennedy was running for president, and gave his famous speech at the Houston Ministerial Association, acknowledging his Catholicism, but arguing that it should not disqualify him from being president. He also said that if his conscience should ever come into conflict with his duty, he would be willing to resign the office. He could say that in 1960. The fact that this guy couldn't say this today about something as small as drinking is really problematic.
This hearing with Hegseth went about the way I expected it to go. Democrats pointing out his absolute lack of fitness for this job. Was this a dog and pony show for the American people? Because it is the Republicans who hold the power to move this nomination along or not. I mean, I'm glad the Democrats didn't just, say nothing. But when you really don't have the power to recommend or not and advance the nomination or not, when you don't have all that is required to do that, is this still meaningful? And if so, why?
It's meaningful because it can set in place stories or narratives that become indelibly attached to that person. When we now think of Brett Kavanaugh in his Supreme Court confirmation hearing, we inevitably think of the charges made against him of sexual assault and of his fondness for beer and of the Saturday Night Live sketch about it. That narrative is attached to him. Now, with a Supreme Court justice, you can't do anything about it once they get on the court. But with the defense secretary, this is somebody who is able to be fired, who is, does have political power and authority. And if the opposition can undermine that authority, then they can advance their own agendas. So what these hearings can do against some of these nominees is to weaken them, to set in place narratives about them that will undermine their effectiveness at promulgating policies that are terrible. I think it's important that the Democrats did some of the things they did today. They set in place markers, and particularly for Hegseth, the Pentagon is the most difficult bureaucracy in American government. There are 3 million employees. There are military officers who have spent their careers learning how to throw sharp elbows within the bureaucracy. There are professionals within that bureaucracy who know exactly how to leak to major news outlets. This is a really, really difficult place to run, to work. And Hegseth will inevitably mess up because he doesn't know how to do anything. And as a result of that, I think you'll start to see these leaks coming out about how unhappy our soldiers are, about how he's hurting the military, about how preparedness is going down, this, that, the other thing, about how he humiliated the country on a trip abroad. Markers are put down in these confirmation hearings that then can be amplified by later leaks.
Supposedly, the way this went is Donald Trump, who loves to watch Fox News, liked Pete Hegseth and offered him this job before anybody did any vetting of Hegseth, assuming, of course, had there been vetting ahead of time, if Trump would have told his people, hey, I'm thinking about this Fox guy, look into him. With everything that's come to light, my guess is they would have passed over Pete Hegseth. But they didn't, and he's the choice on the table now. With Matt Gaetz, he took his name out of contention. Pete Hegseth doesn't seem to have gotten that same kind of pressure, or if he did get the pressure, hasn't responded in the same way. And, Donald Trump seems to admire the fact that Hegseth is willing to tough it out. Donald Trump likes tough people. So this puts the Republicans in the Senate in a tough position. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be willing to call Hegseth up and say, you know what, dude, you gave it your all. Time to go home. What do you think's going to happen?
I think he'll be confirmed. I mean, Joni Ernst's performance today demonstrates that he's likely to be confirmed. She's a veteran. She is a woman senator from Iowa, from the Midwest, from the heartland that the Trump people worship. And she's the key figure, and she's on the Armed Services Committee. If she had decided, as she should have, that he's incompetent and chosen to vote against him, then he would have been sunk. But no Republican took that move, and Ernst didn't take that move. So I suspect he'll get confirmed. I suspect he'll last 7 or 8 months. Then he will be forced to resign for one reason or another, and they'll appoint somebody else.
I think what you just said is a very likely scenario. What I can't understand is why Donald Trump would rather go through that painful process rather than telling Hegseth to walk away right now and trying to find somebody else. Maybe that's just beyond my capability of understanding. Maybe it's beyond Donald Trump's ability to look actually off into the future. Either way, we're going to take a break for the news. Dr. John Murphy and I are going to be right back after that.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
And I'm joined by University of Illinois communications professor Dr. John Murphy. He is an expert on presidential and political rhetoric. Speaking of talking and communicating, it has seemed, John, to a lot of our listeners and to me that after this election, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris disappeared, and not just for a weekend to, rest up and catch up on sleep and maybe lick some wounds, but they have pretty much been absent. I mean, Biden made a speech basically saying goodbye to the State Department yesterday. He gave a eulogy at Jimmy Carter's funeral. I get Kamala Harris's daily schedule, and again today it's like, she'll be meeting with staff privately, and that's it. Is it normal? Am I remembering things correctly? It seems to me when Donald Trump won and Barack Obama was a lame duck president, it seems to me he was out and about quite a bit, talking up what he had done and just, kind of bringing the Democratic energy. Is this unusual, or maybe I'm misremembering and this is always what the party that's lost? Maybe they all go home to lick their wounds and we never really hear from them again.
I think in the case of President Biden, he has been giving a series of speeches. You mentioned the foreign policy address at the State Department. He gave an economic speech a bit ago, summing up his economic record and how he wants to be remembered for changing our priorities about the American economy. The difficulty is that, and this is the difficulty President Biden would have faced had he run for re-election, that the media does not want to cover his speeches anymore. They don't consider him newsworthy, so there's very little coverage of his speeches. And he does not want to do interviews. He doesn't like the major press, legacy media outlets. I think he was done wrong by them. And so he doesn't want to do interviews. As a result, it seems like he's doing nothing when, in fact, he has been out there giving some speeches. Vice President Harris has disappeared. And that is more in the tradition of losing candidates, not necessarily the party as a whole, but candidates who have lost the election generally do disappear for a while and only resurface after a significant period of time, whether it's to run for another office, whether it's to announce another project, or whatever it may be. But she has disappeared, and that's not unusual. I suspect the other thing that's true is that even though the Democratic leadership in Congress is not doing this, they want to give room for the Democratic leadership in Congress to assert themselves and become public faces for the party, which is what they'll need to do over the next couple of years. But I'm not seeing much energy on the part of Democratic leaders in Congress.
Yeah, it seems to me, if this were a normal election year and it was, Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, and it was just, we need to do X, but we both have different ideas how X should be accomplished. But this election was different than that. And Democrats told us this election was are we going to continue to be a democracy? Are we going to continue to have this country? Are we going to slide into fascism? It seemed to me, with the stakes this time around, that Democrats should have picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and started again talking to the American people. I know that the Biden administration is trying to Trump-proof a lot of what he did. They're passing regulations. They're putting roadblocks in place that Trump is going to have to go around to undo things. I don't know whether it's that I want them to talk about that or talk to us about how we survive the next 4 years. What do we do? How do we do it? I mean, I think that people, more so than with a normal presidential election, people are looking for a leader. You know, I've seen some statements and interviews that Chris Murphy gave, the Democratic senator, and I thought that they were terrific. And he even said, like, Democrats, where are you? You know, when Barack Obama was elected, Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, a couple others, they met in the back private room at a restaurant in Washington. And the sole purpose of that meeting was, how are we going to thwart this guy? How are we going to ensure that this guy is a one-term president? What's our plan going to be? I don't see any indication that there's anything like that going on the Democratic side. Do you?
I have not seen anything along those lines. I mean, I think this has always been the paradox of the Biden administration. They're very good at public policy. They're excellent at it. And they're very bad at communicating that public policy. And part of that's due to the president, who is simply not as good a communicator as I had thought he would be. He occasionally gives a good speech, but his refusal to do interviews, the lack of consistency with the speeches, the lack of a consistent presence out in the public, I think has been. Do
you think that's because he's old school? He came up from the, you negotiate, you get it all done privately. You know, you don't make a big deal out of it. You know, you don't advertise anything until it's done. Is that, or is it just Joe Biden's personality? Because I agree with you 100%. People were talking about how even though Biden has delivered a great economy, you know, even Donald Trump said the price of groceries is what put me back in the White House. And somebody pointed out that Bill Clinton pulled off a similar economic recovery. And they said, you know, he was in the White House press briefing room like every week, like, hey, guys, did you see what we did this week? Isn't it great? Look, this is going on and that's going on. And isn't it wonderful? He was his own best spokesperson. And I think in the entire time of his presidency, Biden dropped in to the White House press briefing office once.
I think they believe, rightly or wrongly, that most everybody ignores Biden's actual words and instead just remarks on how old he is. I think Biden really suffered from the fact that this country has very clear markers about age. And about what counts as being too old for something. So if you stumble a little bit, if you're stiff-legged, you count as old. And they feared that every time he went into the press room, all it would do would be to generate more comments about how old he was, not about what he said. And I suspect that was the thinking in the White House.
Would he have been able to counter that by making a bigger deal of his stutter? He gets even though he reaches out to kids who have stutters and brings them along and supports them, I've also heard that when somebody tries to say, well, you know, he didn't do a good job because of his speech problems, that he's like, no, I've overcome all that. I think if he would have, you know, every time he takes the podium, you know, guys, you know, I have a speech impediment, but here I'm going to try to communicate some really important ideas to you. So please forgive me if my tongue gets tangled a little bit. I think he needed to keep reminding people, because there were times when I watched him and I could clearly tell that what somebody, a cursory viewer or listener, might write off as old age was him just trying so hard to enunciate without any kind of stumbling.
I think that's correct. I think also that both he and Harris, no matter how much they disliked legacy media, needed to sit for more interviews and needed to do the stuff Clinton did. Clinton pioneered that kind of effort of going on the Arsenio Hall show, of doing these little sit-downs, of doing informal interviews, of doing interviews that weren't even about public policy, were about interests that they had, or playing the saxophone, or this, that, and the other thing. This administration just did not have a clear public presence. Probably the most effective public communicator in the administration was Pete Buttigieg. And he was the one who was out there. He's the one who went on Fox News. He's the one who's gone on, The Daily Show and other kinds of shows, and MSNBC and all of these other shows. And it's an odd administration in which your Secretary of Transportation is your most effective public communicator.
Yes, indeed it is.
I expect if Harris had won, Pete Buttigieg would have been the Secretary of Defense. I would almost lay dollars to donuts on that one, that Buttigieg would have played a major, major role in the administration and would have been one of its primary spokespeople, because he's really good at this. He is really, really good at this. And the party's got to figure out some way to use his communication skills now that he's out of office and out of power. He can't be allowed to just go home and take care of his kids, much as he wants to, probably, at least for a little while. He needs to be out there.
What is it about the way Pete Buttigieg speaks? If you were teaching a class on Pete Buttigieg 101, what would you point out, that a technique or a style, something that makes him so effective?
He listens, and he answers those questions. So contrast that to the clip you played earlier in our show. If our listeners are just tuning in, I apologize. But we had a clip earlier where the Secretary of Defense nominee, Pete Hegseth, was questioned repeatedly by a U.S. senator, and he would not answer the question. And at times that he talked over her and he would not listen to her. Pete Buttigieg never, ever does that. He listens carefully. He listens quietly. He responds directly to the question. And part of it is just a God-given facility for memorizing and knowing every fact under the sun. And in that way, he's like Bill Clinton. The two of them just have this unreal ability to remember everything they have ever read, and they have read a lot. And that's just a gift that you're not going to get around. But yeah, he's really remarkable at that. And the best thing about his speaking is that he listens. And people can feel him listening. They know he pays attention to them, and that's incredibly important. And that's a quality Jimmy Carter had. Carter could not give a big public speech to give sort of a shout out to our past president who's recently left us. But boy, could he listen. And you put him in a small group. This is why he was such an effective Sunday school teacher. He would listen carefully to what people said. And every bit of testimony we have indicates that his charisma was powerful in a small group. You could feel him in the room. It just didn't carry to a big arena or to a big formal public speech on television. But in a small group, he was remarkable, and Pete Buttigieg has some of that quality.
Interesting. Do you think we will hear more of Pete Buttigieg in political life?
Oh, I think so, and I certainly hope so. I think he's a real talent that Democrats cannot afford to sort of leave on the sidelines. It's not like, Democrats have an enormous amount of talent that they can just afford to waste some.
Interesting. Because I'm a big fan of his as well. But my concern, because people are like, oh, it's too bad he's not running for president. And I was like, yeah. And, he's excellent, but let's look at his resume. He's been the mayor of a small town. And yes, he's been the transportation secretary and he's done really well. But, my fear was that he would be pilloried for, not bringing enough experience to the table. Silly me, thinking something like that
I think
matters.
Donald Trump pretty much got rid of that argument.
I know. I don't know what my problem is.
I felt the same way the first time he ran for president. I thought this guy is just too, but he did a great job as transportation secretary. He showed he could do this job. He truly did, I think. And he had a real eye for, those kinds of sort of ordinary irritations that just make you crazy when you fly. And he found ways to try to fix those things. I mean, he didn't always succeed, but he sure tried.
Yeah.
And he's an effective political operator and a good speaker. And I very much hope he's a big part of the future of the Democratic Party.
Tomorrow, in the 4 o'clock hour, I'm going to be speaking to a guy who writes a business newsletter, Business Travel. And his take on Buttigieg was that initially he thought that he was a little too leaning in the let's make life better for the corporations, but he said he pivoted and turned out to be the consumer's best friend. John, we need to take a quick break. Dr. John Murphy is an expert in presidential rhetoric. We're going to return right after this and talk more about that.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
And I'm joined by Dr. John Murphy, who is a professor of communications at the University of Illinois and an expert in political rhetoric. Okay, we just talked about one of the ways in which Pete Buttigieg is considered a terrific speaker. We now have a whole passel of Republican legislators who are going to try to have to sell really unpopular ideas to the American people. And I imagine that they are going to try to find ways to describe some of these ideas, like a national abortion ban or why we need to privatize Social Security. And they're going to find language that makes these things seem less problematic. Is that what you expect? And what would that look like?
Yes, they're going to try to find different words to describe what they're doing. For instance, rather than talking about a national abortion ban, they will talk about minimum standards for abortion care or minimum standards for health care. They won't even use the term abortion, but buried within the legislation will be requirements that are basically a national abortion ban. And so they will talk about they will only, when it gets to the issue of immigration, they're certainly not going to try to deport, all of these people, but they're going to go after the criminals, even if they do go after all of these people. So it's very much going to be an effort to rebrand, to redefine, to shape reality through language in such a way that their policy seems significantly less threatening. The number one thing they will do is to say that the tax cut they put through is there to help the middle class, and they will call it a middle class tax cut. They will say that every American family is going to get a tax cut and work very hard on hiding the fact that the vast majority of the proceeds are going to go to Elon Musk.
And the first time around when Donald Trump was trying to sell a tax cut, there was, for the first year, there was a slight reduction in what taxes middle-class America was going to pay. And then that little benefit went away, but the one for the rich people didn't and stayed year after glorious year. So there's a lot of different ways to fool people. But why are people so easily fooled?
Because they have been trained for a generation now that all government is bad and that all government, workers are bad, and that anything that takes tax money away from you, that all taxes are bad. And so it becomes a big uphill push to say this kind of tax is actually good. That is why I think Democrats very much need to formulate an alternative, not just to oppose Trump, but to formulate an alternative that heavily relies on taxes on people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. and to call it a billionaire's tax and to go after their wealth and to be very clear, because I think people, every polling indication we have is that people respond positively to that. And beyond that, it's good economics, is to take some of the money all these guys have made and redistribute it in ways that boost the economy and that build our infrastructure out. And so it's both good policy and good politics. And Timothy Snyder, the historian, has floated the idea of creating a people's cabinet, a kind of shadow cabinet as they have in Great Britain, where you appoint particular people to talk about particular kinds of policy, and they become the go-to spokespeople. They become the people that go to the Sunday shows or do interviews with the New York Times or whatever it may be. And I think that idea is worth exploring because it will focus people's attention on specific issues and on democratic alternatives.
Again, isn't that the kind of idea that could have been, that Democrats could have come up with if we had taken a room in the back of a restaurant and our leadership had sat down and said, okay, guys, how are we going to get through the next 4 years? How are we going to keep our message alive and be popular enough to retake things? That shadow cabinet idea, that could have been something that was on the table if Democrats had been able to get their act together to actually, plan something or organize something.
Yeah, but the good news is the way the Democratic Party has always gone forward is generally the people dragging the politicians behind them. Even Franklin Roosevelt was really unclear about whether he wanted Social Security or how it would work. In fact, the whole Second New Deal in 1935-36 was put together by activists and Francis Perkins. This is sort of what we do. This is the big difference. One of the big differences between Democrats and Republicans is that the Republicans have this whole network of think tanks that produce these theoretical things like Project 2025. Well, Democrats have people in the streets doing the work every day, and then ideas percolate up from them. So I suspect there are going to be a lot of activists who are going to push forward a whole series of ideas, and the people who become prominent in Democratic Party circles may not even be evident to all of us now. But they're out there, and I have confidence in them.
So, because one of the things that I've been talking about on this show is who is the person who's going to emerge to lead the resistance, to lead the new democratic ideals, the new Democratic Party. And I guess I was thinking that person would be either an elected official or somebody who wanted to run for office. You're saying that maybe I should look to the political activist organizations for that kind of inspiration and leadership.
You look to all of those places. You look to people like Jessica Valenti, who's doing yeoman's work on abortion and who talks every day in her newsletter about what's going on and what happens. And you combine that with somebody like our governor here in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, who's putting forward the legislation to protect women's health in this state and providing the resources to do so. And it becomes a 1-2 punch of activists out there coming up with new ideas, pointing out problems, doing these issues, and then responsible elected officials trying to respond to that and offer legislation to help it out.
Okay, so is that your word of inspiration for us, John?
That is my word of inspiration. We're a week away from the inauguration. Is there anybody you've seen
so far where you're like, yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about?
Some of this is, I haven't seen, everything's been sort of in suspension, I got to say. And to some extent, that's even been true with the Republicans because they're still trying to thrash out how establishment they're going to be, how radical they're going to be, where these resources are going to go. Mike Johnson has had a terrible time holding together the Republican caucus. They're going to try to create this one gigantic bill, and boy, that's going to be like herding cats.
Donald Trump described it as one big, beautiful bill. That's what he wants. It's going to be beautiful.
It is not going to be beautiful. We're going to see just how the sausage gets made, to use a cliche. But so everybody's been kind of in suspension. And honestly, I think after a dispiriting defeat, Democrats really wanted to enjoy the holidays, to tell you the truth. And I think now, he's going to get inaugurated next week, and the action will pick up, and you'll start to see stuff happening.
Okay. All right. We'll have John Murphy back after the inauguration, and we will dissect the brilliant rhetoric of Donald Trump. Thank you.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, John. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure.
John is a professor at the University of Illinois in the Department of Communication with an expertise in presidential rhetoric. We are going to take a break. We're going to be back with more after this. Now,
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Now, we are pleased to welcome Bobby Kogan to the show, the Senior Director of Federal Budget Policy at the Center for American Progress. Happy 2025. Good to talk.
Hey, Joan. Happy 2025. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, too. We are looking at a week's worth of confirmation hearings for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet. Some of those hearings may not actually take place this week, but you know what? We're patient. We're patient. I want to talk to you as somebody who is an expert on budgets and one of the few people I know that actually makes that subject interesting. What about this one big, beautiful bill that Donald Trump wants Mike Johnson to put together and wants it passed during what's referred to as reconciliation? First of all, explain reconciliation, if you would, and why Donald Trump wants this bill to be done then.
Sure. So in the House of Representatives, you can do whatever you want, right? Take a simple majority, you pass it. In the Senate, for most bills, it takes 60% of the chamber. It takes 60 out of the 100 members due to something called the filibuster. But on reconciliation, as long as you stick to the specific rules of it, then you can do it with only 51 votes instead of 60. So it's a path to allowing Donald Trump to enact some of his agenda. That's why they want to do it. He did it last time. That was how they passed the Trump tax cuts the first time, and it's how they almost repealed the ACA. So it makes some of his agenda very real and very scary as long as they stick to the rules.
Well, speaking of those rules, from what I understand, the kinds of bills that can be voted on during reconciliation or within the reconciliation process, there are rules as to what kinds of bills can and cannot be considered then. And some of what Donald Trump wants in this one great, big, beautiful bill doesn't fall within the rules, if I understand the rules correctly. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, so you are unsurprisingly exactly right. Every single provision of the bill, and what does provision mean? It can be as little as a couple words. It could be a section. It could be a sentence. Every single provision of the bill has to be about getting federal dollars and cents in or out the door. So tax provisions are largely okay for that reason, right? Like you're changing taxes. That's about changing dollars going in and out the door. But it's not enough for something to just affect the budget. It needs to be about that. So Donald Trump wants to do like a deportation force. That's spending government money to do a thing. That sort of thing is allowed. Donald Trump wants to change asylum rules, to be kind of inhumane and make it so folks seeking asylum can, no longer get entry or that sort of stuff. That sort of thing isn't allowed, right? Because that's not about changing your dollars and cents. Yes, that affects the federal spending, but that's about changing immigration law. That's not about dollars and cents. So there's a whole host of things you can do. Trump tax cuts, cuts to healthcare, very scary, very real, right? Like potentially cuts to the social safety net, like our nutrition assistance, that sort of stuff, very potentially real. Deportation squad, a wall, kind of, detention facilities, that's all within the realm of what's allowed. Some of what he wants to do in energy, maybe not allowed. Permitting reform, not allowed. And as I say, changes to immigration law, definitely not allowed.
Okay, is anybody going to explain this to him? No, I mean, seriously, or is Mike Johnson just going to say, yes, sir, and put all this stuff that isn't allowed? I mean, Mike Johnson should know better. I'm confused.
Yeah, so the House is going to do whatever the House wants. These rules are really Senate rules. And so frequently when the House passes its version of the bill, it is replete with things that are not allowed. And then it gets over to the Senate, and then the Senate strips them out. Any of these things that are quote-unquote not allowed, as long as you get 60 votes, you can keep them in. But normally you don't, because they use this to be a partisan process. So when it comes over to the Senate, they will go through and either proactively strip out a bunch of things, or they will take votes on them, and then they won't achieve 60 votes. They'll come out. The one scary thing is you always have the option of just firing the Senate parliamentarian. That actually happened in 2001 when they were doing the Bush tax cuts. They fired the Senate parliamentarian because he gave them rulings they didn't like in reconciliation. And so theoretically, that's on the back burner. Thune, the majority leader, says he doesn't want to do that, but it's, you could get down to it where Trump says, fire him because otherwise you can't do fire her because otherwise you can't do my agenda. And then all of a sudden there's agitation and we'll see. So this is a true TBD moment.
Wow. That's really interesting. I don't know if it was Thune, but there was some Republican senator after, Donald Trump started talking about this one big, beautiful bill. There was a Republican senator who clearly didn't want to correct Trump, was like, it might be better if we split it into two bills. That just might be, that might be a better way to go. And Donald Trump's still like, why bother? I want one big, beautiful bill.
That's exactly right. So that was Thune. And so Republicans are trying to do a couple things. They want to increase defense spending, increase money at the border, and do some of their energy stuff. And that was what Thune wanted to do in the first bill. They also want to do Trump tax cuts 2.0, which I'd be remiss if I didn't remind viewers, these tax cuts were incredibly expensive and gave the disproportionate amount of their money to the super rich. So these are ones that kind of did a modicum for many people in the middle class and huge tax cuts for the rich. So they want to continue those. They were set to expire and they now are up for extension. So they want to do this again. And then they are also looking at doing these giant cuts to the social safety net. And that's the confusion. Some of their agenda is unfortunately pretty popular. Some of it is kind of popular, kind of not. And some of it is profoundly unpopular, right? So like the Trump tax cuts 1.0, they lost like a dozen House members. Why? Because they were really expensive. They gave a disproportionate amount to the wealthy. And then they actually raised taxes on about 10% of Americans and kind of disproportionately raised taxes on the middle class. So it was a pretty tough sell to say we're going to do multi-trillion dollars worth of taxes for the rich and corporations, and we're going to raise some taxes in the middle class, right? So some Republicans actually voted against that. That's up. It's actually going to be more difficult than I think they are ready to believe. And that's why initially they were planning to actually already be working and have a bill ready to be signed on day one. And now they say, we might be ready by May, right? And that's, I think, a recognition of the fact that they don't know what they're doing because it is really difficult for them to do their unpopular agenda.
Bobby, we need to take a break. And when we come back, I want to use your federal budget expertise, because my understanding from listening to various pundits was that while there are many parts of the Trump agenda that perhaps will be altered or derailed by Democrats, the one thing that everybody seems to be on the same page with is that Donald Trump will absolutely get his tax cuts. I want to talk to you about that. Bobby Cogan is the senior director of federal budget policy for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. We are going to be right back after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Bobby Cogan is the Senior Director of Federal Budget Policy at the Center for American Progress. And we are talking about some of the things Donald Trump wants to accomplish, including a great big tax a break for his billionaire buddies. And I know that votes for a lot of the things Trump wants to do are going to be extremely tight. But, Bobby, everything I've read so far said the one thing that you can count on is that, A, in the earliest days of his administration, this tax cut is going to be a priority and that he is definitely going to get it done. Are you as sure as they are?
I think he will probably get it done. The politics of letting it expire are different from the politics of doing it in the first place. I just think it is actually going to be difficult for them for a couple of reasons. The first is that it is really expensive, right? It's a $4 trillion tax bill that they are planning to not pay for, right? So that's $4 trillion more of higher debt. And at the same time, it is disproportionately massively going to the rich, right? So the average tax cut that the top 1.1% gets is like $275,000. And then the average tax cut for like the middle American is $1,000, right? So it is giving way, way, way more to the rich than anyone else. But at the same time, they deliberately give a modicum, a pittance to most Americans while they're giving huge amounts to the rich so that they say, oh, well, we can't let it go away or else everyone's going to see their taxes go up. So I said, it raised taxes on about 10% of Americans. That's true. It cut taxes on about 65% of Americans. So if they don't get it done, about 65% of Americans are going to see their taxes go up a tiny bit, and then the rich are going to see their taxes go up a lot. But a tiny bit is more than zero, and so that's something that they're really contending with. On the flip side, as I say, they are uncomfortable with the fact that they will be responsible for $4 trillion more of debt. And at the same time, that it would be continuing that 10% of Americans whose taxes went up under it. Those are kind of tough things for them all to deal with. They also at the same time have people who say, oh, well, we'll deal with it being expensive by doing lots of nasty, mean cuts. But then all of a sudden, some people start to freak out because of that, right? And so kind of dealing with all the difficulties in their caucus is what makes it difficult. Again, I do think that they'll be able to do it, but they lost about a dozen people last time, and that's because this is not a good bill.
One of the things that I think Elizabeth Warren even came out and said, Donald Trump wants to get rid of the debt ceiling. I'm all for it. I'll vote for that. Usually the debt ceiling is a club that Republicans use to beat up Democrats. It means well, you know what, Bobby, why don't you explain? You're probably, you've got a better explanation of it than me. So go ahead. Explain the debt ceiling and why Donald Trump wants to either eliminate it or raise it.
Sure. So as you say, it is a club used by Republicans against Democrats. The debt seal back in the day, anytime the U.S. wanted to issue any debt, we would have to pass a new law saying, OK, we can issue more debt to do the spending we want to do. Starting in World War I, we said, why don't we just give Treasury the authority to borrow up to a limit? That way we don't have to do a new law anytime we want to do more debt. You can just be like, okay, borrow up to this amount. And that's how we do it now. It's kind of changed a little bit over time, especially during World War II. But, now we say you can just borrow as much as you need up to this amount. And whenever there's a Republican president and we hit the debt limit, people say, cool, we'll just increase the debt limit. But when there's a Democratic president, all of a sudden it becomes the biggest issue in the planet and Republicans threaten to default. Now, why am I saying it's a default? Because you have one set of laws that say you must spend this way and you must tax this way, and therefore we're going to be carrying out a deficit and raising debt. And you have another law that says it is illegal to take out debt to carry out those. So you would be defaulting not only in your bondholders, but defaulting in the obligations of the United States of America, defaulting on our veterans, defaulting on people, states that people are supposed to get their Medicaid, defaulting on people who are supposed to get their housing, right? We would not be carrying out what we said in law we must do. So I'm totally in agreement with Senator Warren. We should eliminate the debt limit. The worst possible thing we could do is continue the practice of saying, we'll just give you a pass when it's Republican president, and then it'll kick back in when there's a Democratic president, and then they'll threaten to default again if they don't get what they want. That's what happened under Obama. That's what happened under Biden. In each case, they extorted huge cuts to critical programs, right? They were able to force cuts to programs that Americans rely on because of the debt limit. So my opinion is what Republicans did when Biden was president. They said, you guys need to do this entirely by yourself without any votes. And so we should say to them, fine, you guys can do the same thing. And if you can't do that, we will swoop in. We will be responsible. And by being responsible, we will defuse this nuclear bomb for forever. We will not let anyone else threaten the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
And other countries don't have there are many countries where there is no debt ceiling. The government wants to spend money, even if it means racking up debt, and they do it. There's not this cap that politicians keep running into, correct?
Yes, so that's exactly right. We're one of only 2 countries in the world with a fixed dollar debt limit. And it's in recognition of, if you want to change your debt, you change your spending and tax law. That's the way to do it. If you say, oh, I don't really like the trajectory I'm on, you raise taxes, you cut spending, or you do some combo of the two. You don't say, hey, I have tax and spending law, and also it's illegal to carry it out and I'm going to default, right? That's crazy. No one would do that. You don't have it so your left hand and your right hand are in contradiction. And that's why other countries don't do it the way that we do it. Ours is a vestige of a very old way of thinking.
And this might be one issue where, oddly, there's more Democratic support than Republican support, because I'm thinking about Chip Roy, who has made it his life's mission to keep a lid on debt. And if Donald Trump decides that he wants the debt ceiling raised or eliminated, I can see him losing a lot of members of his own party.
Yeah, so this is why initially Republicans were saying, and Trump was saying, oh, we'll get the debt limit increased in the CR that kind of continued federal government funding. And Democrats, I think rightly said, give me a break. A year and a half ago, you said debt was an existential threat and you almost forced us into default. And now you just want to give us, you want us to give you a free ride. No way, do it on your own. And so you started seeing Republicans saying, oh, well, we'll do the debt limit and reconciliation, right? Reconciliation, remember, it has to be, as we were talking about, it has to be budgetary, but you can also do the debt limit and reconciliation. So, we said, okay, well, Republicans were saying, yeah, well, why don't we do the debt limit and reconciliation? I think, to your point, they know that they don't have the votes for that, right? They can only afford to lose 3 people in the Senate and 2 people in the House, and I don't think they have the votes to do that. So you saw them just the other day. They said, why don't we attach that to the California aid bill? They'll say, we'll only help California if you help us out with the debt limit. And again, my position here is the debt limit doesn't make any sense. We're one of only 2 countries in the world that does it this way. If you guys want, you guys should raise the debt limit, and if you can't be responsible enough to do that, we will be responsible by getting rid of it.
Do you think Democrats will fold? Because that does sound like the kind of thing Republicans will do. We're going to give you all these reasons to get rid of the debt ceiling, even though we've fought it for many years. But if you want California to get this federal money, you better agree to this. As opposed to when Democrats are in power and they give away what stuff they want. I want them to have to give away stuff they want this time around, Bobby.
Yeah, so I don't have a good sense of what'll happen. I think the Biden, the recent debt limit stuff is very fresh in people's minds, right? So when Democrats had a trifecta, Republicans said, if you want to raise the debt limit, you will do it all by yourself. And so we did it all by ourselves. And then when Republicans took the House, they said debt is the biggest, most important thing on the planet. And we will force you into default if you don't give us enough spending cuts. And so we gave them enough spending cuts. That happened in the Obama era as well. And after 2011, that happened in 2011. After that, Obama said never again. and we did a fake negotiation around the 2013 one, and 2015 was done with no fanfare. And that's why Democrats in the Trump era were like, okay, we're happy to help because we believe that this has been defused. We think the Obama, the Obama extortion was a one and done. But then they did it again under Biden, and so I think Democrats will feel differently about it. TBD on kind of whether they hold the line on that. But I will say I am publicly agitating for folks to say, we will help you, but we won't help you just for the Trump era. We'll help you by, my joke is we'll help you by getting rid of it, but we can compromise on getting rid of it for 40 years, right? And then we can rediscuss in 40 years.
I think the key phrase for me in what you just said was hold the line. I hope that Democrats can be as tough and be as firm with the Republicans as Republicans seem to have no trouble being with them. And I look forward in the coming months to having you on again and we can say, look at them. Aren't we proud of them? How they held the line.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be the good future.
Yes, and I'm with you. I will also talk about this and make sure, to the best of my ability, people understand, and that we hold Democrats' feet to the fire. It's time. It's time to get tough. Bobby, I am so out of time. Thank you so much for being here. Bobby Kogan, Senior Director of Federal Budget Policy. He makes us understand things and makes federal budgets interesting. Thank you for being here, Bobby.
Joan, the pleasure is always mine. Thanks for having me on.
Well, no, the pleasure's mine. Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez is next. Dan Schaefer is going to be with her. She's also going to be giving away a streaming code for Stephanie Miller. So if you didn't make it this time, you've got another chance. And, of course, Richard Chu starts our day at 6 a.m., he's going to be giving away a streaming code as well. So I will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Have a great evening, my friends. Good night.